Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode number 19 of History for Shut-ins. Today's flag is a flag that was used during the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s during the George Washington presidency. I thought it was appropriate as we're talking about Andrew Jackson today, who not only expanded the power of the presidency, but truly reinforced the superiority of federal law over state law with the nullification crisis that we had talked about in our last session. So today we will finish up with Andrew Jackson and then move on to Martin Van Buren, who is many times overlooked but played a very important role in the strengthening of the Democratic Party. In the election of 1832, Jackson had come out, as we talked, against the American system that had been pushed by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun and the like. He created a new issue by vetoing the Recharter of the Bank of the United States. Remember, there was an issue back 20 years previously during the administration of Jefferson and then Monroe when we're talking about rechartering the Bank of the United States. The American system supporters were now calling themselves National Republicans, still not the Republican Party that we know today, nor truly the one that is founded by Abraham Lincoln, amongst others. So the National Republicans in 1824 nominate Henry Clay, their standard bearer. A third party also took the field. This was the Anti-Masonic Party, formed in reaction to exposures of political favoritism and corruption by members of the Fraternal Order of Freemasons, a group that many of the founding fathers belonged to. Strong in the North, the anti-Masons nominated former Attorney General William Wirt. They were generally against Jackson, but thoughts of uniting with national Republicans to beat Jackson diminished when Clay refused to denounce the Masonic Order. He and Jackson were both members of the Masonic Order. The 1832 campaign introduced a national nominating convention in place of the Congressional Caucus as a means of selecting a candidate. The National Republicans and Anti-Masons held conventions and adopted formal addresses to the public. Jackson's followers, popularly though not yet officially known as Democrats, met in Baltimore to endorse Jackson's choice of Martin Van Buren for president, or vice president, pardon me. To show their unanimity, they also adopted a rule requiring a 2/3 vote for nomination, majority vote, a rule that would later deprive Martin Van Buren the Democratic presidential nomination in 1844. Despite the new issues and innovations in party organization, the election was essentially the 1828 election replayed. Jackson defeated Clay handily with 55% of the popular vote and 219 electoral votes. Jackson read his victory as a mandate of his policies, especially the bank veto, which we're going to talk about next. So the congressional alliance of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun foreshadowed a convergence of all of Jackson's enemies into a new opposition party. The issue that sealed the coalition, solidified Jackson's own following, and dominated his second term was the recharter of the Bank of the United States. The bank was a quasi-public corporation chartered by Congress to manage the federal government's finances and provide a national currency that was sound. It was headquartered in Philly. In fact, the bank is, I believe, at 4th and Chestnut in Philadelphia. It had branches throughout the states. It was the United States' only national financial institution. The federal government owned 20% of the stock, and the President of the United States appointed 20% of the directors of the board. Like other banks chartered by state legislatures, the bank lent for profit and issued paper currency backed by specie reserves. Its notes were federal legal tender. By law, it was also the federal government's banker, in that it arranged its loans and storing, transferred and dispersed its funds. The bank's national reach and official status gave it great leverage over state banks, as you would assume, and over the American supply of money and credit. So it had leverage over the money supply and over credit. The original Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791 at the urging of our good friend Alexander Hamilton. Opposition to it was one of the founding tenets of the Democratic Republican Party, who was led by Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Republicans allowed the bank to expire when its 20-year charter ran out in 1811. But the government's financial issues in the War of 1812 forced reconsideration. In 1816, Congress chartered the second bank again for 20 years. This is under the Monroe administration. Bad lending, bad management, corruption, so forth, brought the second bank into trouble during the boom and bust cycle that was extremely speculative, which culminated in the Panic of 1819, which we had discussed. Calls increased for revocation of the charter, but the stewardship of the new bank president, Nicholas Biddle, did much to repair its reputation in the 1820s. By 1828, when Jackson is first elected, the bank was, for the most part, not controversial. Most informed observers saw it as crucial and indispensable. Startling his own supporters, Jackson attacked the bank in his first message to Congress in 1829. Biddle attempted to conciliate Jackson, but Jackson's opposition to renewing the charter was fierce. He was convinced that the bank was not only unconstitutional, as Jefferson and his followers had long maintained, but that its concentrated financial power was a threat to popular liberty. With the advice of Senators Henry Clay seems to be involved in everything, and Daniel Webster, Biddle sought a congressional recharter in 1832. And of course, Clay and Jackson are at loggerheads. Clay and Webster calculated that Jackson would not issue a veto during an election year. If he did, they would make an issue of it in the campaign. The recharter bill passed Congress. On July 10th, Jackson vetoes it. The veto message was a defining moment for Jackson's presidency. Clearly intended for public consumption, parts of it read more like a political manifesto than a communication to Congress. Jackson recited his constitutional objections and introduced questionable economic arguments aimed at foreign ownership of bank stock. But the crux of his message was its attack on special privilege enjoyed by private stockholders in a government-chartered corporation. Though some were outraged at his turn against the bank, the veto held up in Congress. It became the prime issue in the presidential campaign of 1832, with both sides distributing copies of Jackson's veto message. Jackson read his reelection as a mandate to pursue his attack on the bank even further. As soon as the nullification crisis resolved in 1833, Jackson took his next step against the bank. The bank's open involvement in the presidential campaign convinced Jackson that it was corrupt. To weaken it until its charter ran out in 1836, Jackson was determined to withdraw the federal government's own deposits from the bank and place them in selected state chartered banks. This was a move that required delicacy, which Jackson was not known for. Under the charter, the Secretary of the Treasury, not the President of the United States, had the authority to remove deposits. The Secretary of the Treasury also had to explain his reasons to Congress, where the House of Representatives had just voted by a 2-to-1 margin that the deposits should stay where they were. Jackson canvassed his cabinet on removal of funds. Most of them opposed it, but he got the support and arguments that he needed from his Attorney General, Roger Taney, or Taney, depending on how you pronounce it, who ends up being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, arguably one of the worst. We'll talk about him in upcoming sessions. Jackson drew up a paper explaining his decision. He read it to his cabinet and ordered the Treasury Secretary, William John Duane, to execute the removal of funds. Duane refused. He also refused to resign, so Jackson fired him and put Taney in his place. So Taney moves from Attorney General to Treasury Secretary. Imagine if that happened today, how people would just go bananas. Taney ordered the removal, which was largely complete by the time Congress met in December of 1833. Congressional foes of the bank could not believe what Jackson had done. He defied Congress's intent, rode roughshod over the Treasury's statutory control over the public purse, and removed funds from the lawfully authorized, responsible hands of the banks of the United States, Bank of the United States, to untried, unregulated, and pretty much irresponsible, for the most part, state banks. To many, Jackson saw himself as above the law. Fortunately for Jackson, Biddle, who was still the bank president, overreacted and played into Jackson's hands. Seeing removal of the deposits basically as a declaration of war, Biddle forced a recharter by creating a financial panic. Loss of the deposits required some curtailment of the bank's loans, but Biddle carried the contraction further than necessary in an effort to squeeze businessmen into demanding a recharter. The manipulation of credit for political ends discredited the bank and vindicated Jackson's actions. Congress did not consider the recharter, but it did lash out at Jackson. Southern anti-tariffs could not agree on the American system. They could not agree on rechartering the bank. So those who were against the tariff, remember the nullification crisis of 1832, South Carolina. But what united them was their outrage at Jackson's high-handed proceedings in or against the bank. In the 1833-34 session, Jackson's congressional foes converged to form a new party. This new party is the Whigs, which is a stepping stone to the Republican Party. The name Whigs, of course, is borrowed from Revolutionary era United States and opponents of Great Britain of royal prerogative. The Whigs held a Senate majority. They rejected Jackson's nominees for government directors of the bank, rejected Tawney as Secretary of the Treasury, and in March of 1834 adopted a resolution of censure against Jackson for assuming, quote, authority and power not conferred by the Constitution and laws, but in derogation of both, unquote. Jackson protested the censure, arguing that the Senate had adopted the moral equivalent of an impeachment conviction without formal charges, without a trial, and without the necessary two-thirds vote. Jackson's defenders expunged censure from the Senate Journal in 1837 at the end of Jackson's term, after Democrats won majority control of the Senate. The bank, defeated, retired from the fight after the 1834 session. When its charter expired, it accepted a new one from Pennsylvania and continued to operate as a state institution, not a federal institution. Meanwhile, the state banks, cut loose from central restraint and drowning now in federal money, went on a lending spree that helped fuel a speculative boom in Western lands. Everything crashed in the Panic of 1837, which broke out just as Jackson retired from office. The ensuing depression plagued Martin Van Buren's presidency and lingered into the 1840s. Jackson's experiment with the state banks, which was a failure, helped drive his economic thinking to radical extremes. He renounced all banknote currency and demanded a return to what was called hard money of gold and silver. To that end, and to curb speculation, he ordered the issuance of what he called specie circular in 1836, requiring payment in coin for Western public lands. By the end of his presidency, he was attacking all chartered corporations, including manufacturing concerns, turnpike and canal companies, and banks as instruments of aristocratic privilege and engines of oppression. His farewell address in 1837, drafted largely by Tawney, warned of an insidious quote-unquote money power that threatened to subvert United States liberty. As far as slavery and abolition are concerned, during Jackson's presidency, the questions surrounding slavery grow, and they will continue to. Abolitionists organized and flooded the country and Congress with pleas and petitions to get rid of slavery. Defenders of slavery reacted violently. They demanded, in the interest of public safety, that criticism of slavery be silenced. Some, including our South Carolina friends who were nullifiers, linked abolitionism to the tariff as part of a systematic campaign of Northern oppression against the South. In the next couple of classes, when we talk about slavery and abolition, the South always is casting a weary eye north, because the North, again, is separating themselves economically, politically, also with the population that is now immigrants that are now coming into the North. So the South is on the lookout for boogeymen everywhere. There is nothing to show that Jackson ever thought slavery was a moral question. It was not in his character to think this way. He was more a man of action than a man of deep thought and philosophy. He grew up with slavery. He bought and sold slaves. He reacted to the abolitionist controversy in purely political terms. He perceived it as a threat to sectional harmony and to the Democratic Party. During Jackson's administration, Congress began adopting annual gag rules to keep discussion of abolition petitions off the House and Senate floor. Remember, we had talked about this with John Quincy Adams. After his presidency in 1828, he joins Congress for the next 20 years. And this was a big issue of his. He was anti-slavery and he hated the gag rules. In 1835, abolitionists sent thousands of anti-slavery tracts through the mails to Southern clergy, Southern officials, and prominent citizens. Many were never delivered because they were intercepted by Southern postmasters or angry mobs. Jackson and Postmaster General Amos Kendall approved such action. Jackson recommended federal suppression of what he called incendiary publications and damned abolitionists' wicked attempts, as he called it, to incite a slave rebellion. His farewell address in 1837 warned of the dangers of sectional fanaticism. And of course, it's that sectional fanaticism that helps lead to the Civil War. From a foreign policy standpoint, a dispute with France brought both nations to the brink of war. In an 1831 treaty, France agreed to pay claims for Napoleonic depredations on American shipping. The French Chamber of Deputies, however, refused to appropriate the money. Jackson asked Congress to authorize reprisals if the money was not paid. The French government demanded retraction of this insult as a condition of payment. Jackson responded that what he said to Congress was none of a foreign government's business. The impasse grew through 1835. Ministers were recalled and military preparations began. Finally, the British step in. France agrees to read a conciliatory passage in a later message of Jackson's as an apology. France then pays. The same could not be said of Jackson's dealings with Mexico. Jackson craved the Mexican border province of Texas and made its purchase the top priority of his diplomacy. Given the instability of Mexico's government and suspicions of America, a Texas negotiation required great discretion and patience. Again, we said Jackson wasn't really known for either. Jackson's chosen agent, Anthony Butler, also had neither trait. And Jackson's own careless instructions encouraged Butler's clumsy dabbling in bribery and personal influence. His actions, combined with a flow of American settlers into Texas, increased Mexican fears of United States plans. In 1835, American immigrants to Texas, led by Jackson's old Tennessee comrade Sam Houston, successfully revolted against Mexico, declaring independence. Jackson wisely declined to endorse American annexation of Texas or recognize the new republic without prior congressional approval. His earlier inept efforts to buy Texas helped to sow the seeds of mutual distrust that would ultimately lead to war between Mexico and the United States a decade later. Jackson's legacy is that he melded an amorphous coalition of personal followers who elected him as president and really helped to build the most durable and successful political party. And they also helped to build an electoral machine whose organization and discipline would serve as a model for all others. His conduct, which was controversial while in office, galvanized opponents to organize the Whig Party. Democrats were the child of Andrew Jackson. The national two-party system is Jackson's legacy. His drive for party organization was spurred by his difficulties with Congress. Unlike other strong presidents, Jackson defined himself not enacting legislative programs, but thwarting one. In his 8 years, we talked about this, Congress passed one major law, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. During this time, Jackson vetoed 12 bills, more than his 6 predecessors combined. One was the first pocket veto in the history of the United States. Pocket veto is when an outgoing Congress passes a bill. Rather than signing it or vetoing it, if the president basically sits on it until a newly elected Congress is in session, then the bill is null and void. So that's a pocket veto. The Maysville Road and bank vetoes were enduring statements of his political philosophy. Andrew Jackson, strengthened himself against Congress by forging direct links with the voters. His official messages spoke in plain and powerful language to the people at large. He saw himself as the people's tribune. Does this sound familiar? Their sole defender against special interests and Congress. In other ways, Jackson expanded presidential authority. He dominated his cabinet, forcing out members who would not execute his commands. In 2 terms, he had 4 secretaries of state and 5 secretaries of the Treasury. Holding his official subordinates at arm's length, Jackson devised and implemented his policies through private advisors and publicists. These folks were known as his kitchen cabinet because they were basically a rubber stamp on anything he said. His bold initiatives and domineering style caused opponents to call him King Andrew and to take the name Whigs to signify their opposition to executive tyranny. Jackson believed Republican government should be simple, frugal, and accessible. Sounds like Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. He cherished the extinction of the national debt during his administration, believing that social inequities were fostered rather than fixed by government intervention. He embraced laissez-faire as the policy most conducive to economic equality and political liberty. We're now going to move on to Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren. I will admit the next several presidents are usually overlooked because once we speak about Jackson, the next president spoken about more often than not is Lincoln because of the Civil War and slavery and on and on. Martin Van Buren plays a major role in the coalescing of the Democratic Party. Van Buren worked hard to build his friendship and political alliance with Jackson. These efforts came to fruition in 1836 when Jackson chooses Van Buren as his vice president. Van Buren initially started as anti-Jackson. Jackson and key Democrats rallied behind Van Buren as their presidential candidate in 1834. Van Buren had little trouble securing the nomination, winning it on a unanimous first ballot vote at the convention. His running mate was Congressman Richard Johnson of Kentucky. Van Buren presented his candidacy as a continuation of Andrew Jackson's administration and policies. Many voters, particularly in Democratic strongholds, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, loved Jackson and were pleased to vote for his heir, Van Buren. Van Buren benefited from the Democratic Party organization he helped to build over the previous decade. The Democratic Party in 1836 were disciplined, well organized, which brought more Democrat voters, to the polls. Van Buren, I have Jackson on the brain. Van Buren received 85,000 more votes than Jackson did in 1832. So it shows you a couple of things. It shows you how well organized the Democrats are. What else does it show you? Immigrants are pouring into this country, working on and on, getting the right to vote. So that is a big jump. Whigs, in comparison, though they are still new and not as mature organizationally or ideologically as the Democrats, did offer some good competition to Van Buren. Whigs ran against Jackson, saying he had a monarchical personality and his politics were roughshod. Whigs saw Van Buren as a party hack and warned that his election would only allow Democrats to carry out their flawed policies. With no unity to settle on a candidate or hold a national convention, the Whigs ran 3 regional candidates. In the South, Tennessee Senator Hugh White. In the East, Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster. And in the West, it was William Henry Harrison of Ohio. Van Buren received more votes than all 3 Whig candidates combined. His victory resulted from a combination of his own attractive political and personal qualities, Jackson's popularity, of course, organizational power of the Democrats, and the inability of the Whig Party to muster an effective campaign and, quite frankly, an effective candidate. You have 3 choices. There were signs of trouble ahead for the Democrats. They won a smaller percentage of electoral votes in 1836 than in 1832, carrying fewer southern states. Georgia and Tennessee actually voted for the Whigs. Where Democrats did win, it was by significantly smaller margins than in 1832. So the Whig Party is gaining steam, although it's new. And again, it will metamorphosize into the Republican Party. Van Buren easily wins the Democratic nomination for a second term, but he and the Democrats were faced with a difficult re-election in 1840. Van Buren's presidency had been a difficult one, with the U.S. economy in a severe downturn. Other divisive issues, which we've talked about, slavery, Western expansion. The British seem to pop up every few years, so there are tensions with Great Britain, provided opportunities for Van Buren's opponents and some Democrats to criticize him. Also damaging to his re-election chances was a growth in the political strength of the Whigs and its maturation of their organization. It became much more professional. Whigs selected William Henry Harrison as their candidate. Interesting. Just one candidate this time. Although Harrison, and we're talking about the election of 1840, although Harrison hailed from a wealthy Virginia family, he had made a name for himself fighting Native Americans in the Northwest Territories, basically what would become Ohio and Indiana. He was colorful. He was a tall and tough warrior. He was represented to the people by the Whigs as the antithesis of Martin Van Buren. Whigs ran a great campaign. They flooded the public with promotional odds and ends with the slogan Tippecanoe, which was the battle that Harrison won, and Tyler too, Tyler being the vice presidential candidate for the Whigs. One Whig rally drew 60,000 to the rural site of one of Harrison's military victories, which, think of it, for the time is an amazing turnout because getting there is difficult at best. When a Democrat newspaper, wrote of Harrison, quote, "Give him a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him. He will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin," unquote. Whigs seized on this and they anointed Harrison the, quote, "log cabin and hard cider candidate," cementing a homespun image. But again, Harrison came from a wealthy family, was well educated, on and on and on. It didn't matter that Harrison's background had this. Whig Representative Charles Ogle from Pennsylvania unleashed a vicious attack from the floor of the House in April 1840 that gained national attention. Whigs gave Van Buren a new nickname, Martin Van Ruin, because of the Depression. Things grew uglier when the Whigs publicized allegations, which were true, that Vice President Richard Johnson had had several affairs with African American women. In the election of 1840, Van Buren did not personally campaign. Citizens of the United States questioned his views on the events of the day, and it offered Martin Van Buren the opportunity to defend his record and embrace Jacksonian ideals that he and the Democrats purportedly represented: strict adherence to the Constitution, the protection of states' rights, and federal government of limited power. His remarks, Van Buren's, which took the form of letters to his questioners, were often reprinted in Democrat newspapers. Van Buren remained optimistic about his reelection. 80% of eligible voters went to the polls on election day in 1840. That's crazy. If we get 40 to 50%, I think we're lucky. Van Buren remained close in the popular vote, but Harrison crushes him in the Electoral College. So in the one term of Van Buren, at the 1837 inauguration, it was less a celebration of Van Buren being elected than a tribute to Andrew Jackson. With one exception, the new administration retained Jackson's entire cabinet, which you could say is a mistake. Van Buren pledged to, quote, "tread generally in the footsteps of President Jackson," unquote. The severe downturn in the American economy that began in 1836 became Van Buren's top concern. There were three causes to the downturn. First, British banks, responding to financial troubles at home, stopped pumping money into the U.S. economy, which was an important reversal because those funds had financed much of America's economic growth over the preceding 2 decades. So basically, the time after the War of 1812 to this point. The second reason, American banks, which had overextended credit to their clients, began to call in loans after British banks decreased the amount of money that they were putting in the American economy. Third, Jackson's hard money policies, remember the 1836 specie circular, actually increased the credit crunch. When Van Buren entered office, it was clear that American economic health was taking a turn for the worse, and that prosperity of the early 1830s was over. On May 10th, 1837, some important state banks in New York, Van Buren's home state, running out of hard currency reserves, suddenly refused to convert paper money into gold or silver. Other financial institutions throughout America quickly followed suit. This financial crisis, which had been the worst faced by the United States to that time, would become the Panic of 1837. Loans dried up, as did new purchases. Businesses and civic projects completely collapsed. It's almost like the Great Depression. Many went unemployed. Many go hungry. Creditors refused to accept paper currency that seemed to be losing its value. Van Buren blamed the current problems not on Jackson's policies, but what he viewed as greedy American and foreign business and financial institutions, as well as on the overextension of credit by U.S. banks. So he's right in some points, but not blaming Jackson is an issue because that's also one of the reasons here. Questions arose for Van Buren on how or whether he was to respond. He followed a course of action consistent with his beliefs in the limited powers of federal government and suspicion of paper money and easy credit. He called for a special session of Congress, which convened in October of 1837. Van Buren announced a controversial proposal to establish an independent treasury system in which the federal government would deposit funds in a series of sub-treasuries. Sounds crazy. Van Buren and his advisors hoped that an independent treasury would stabilize the American financial system by refusing poorly managed state banks access to government money, which those state banks might use very recklessly. The independent treasury proposal reversed Jackson's decision to deposit federal money in state banks. Critics of Van Buren completely lose it. Some came from his own party, two groups of dissident Democrats, one supporting the state banks and one suspicious of all banks, attacked this solution of Van Buren's. Whigs traced the economic downturn to Jackson's economic and fiscal policies, especially his decision not to recharter the national bank. They argued that America's economy required a national bank to manage the economy and cultivate economic stability. Congressional resistance to the independent treasury proposal was extremely difficult to overcome. Some of Van Buren's closest allies from New York questioned his thinking. Not until the summer of 1840 did Congress pass an independent Treasury bill. By then, despite a recovery in 1839, the American economy had been mired in a depression for nearly 4 years. The depression would be a major issue in the 1840 re-election campaign. There were two other problems that were issues for Van Buren, domestic issues, that is. During his last months in office, Jackson, as we had mentioned, made it clear that he favored annexation of Texas. Americans who favored annexation were heartened by Jackson's position, while others, especially from the North, opposed annexation because it could lead to another slave state being brought into the Union. So slavery is there everywhere with many issues at this time. Van Buren inherited the issue and tried to prevent a sectional split that would harm the Democrats. He announced in August of 1837 that he did not support annexation. It helped to decrease sectional tensions over territorial expansion and slavery. So it's a wise move, but he goes against his mentor, Andrew Jackson. The Van Buren administration was also hostile to Native Americans. As we had mentioned, federal policy under Jackson sought through the Indian Removal Act of 1830 to move all Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi River. Continuing this policy, Van Buren supported further removals after his election in 1836. The federal government supervised removal of the Cherokees in 1838, which was a forced stagger west to the Mississippi, in which 25% of the Cherokee people died. Some Native Americans resisted the removal policy violently. In Florida, Seminoles fought 5,000 American troops. Death of their charismatic leader, Chief Osceola, in 1838 failed to quell their resistance. Fighting continued into the 1840s and brought death to thousands of Native Americans. The protracted nature of the conflict had brutal political consequences as well. Whigs, as well as a small number of Americans who thought that the removal campaign was inhumane, criticized Van Buren's conduct of the war. We are going to end there for today. Thank you to all who joined. If there are any questions, feel free to leave them here for me, and I will answer for you. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you on Monday, April 20th at 5 p.m., where we continue with the presidency of Martin Van Buren, and we also talk about William Henry Harrison. Thanks so much. Take care.